Hi, my name is Mark Levine. I host the Inside Scoop on Washington every Sunday from noon to 3 p.m. on We Act Radio. I've been hosting the Inside Scoop since 2003 when I quit my job as a congressional attorney. I began on a suburban radio station in Northern Virginia. Since then, I've been syndicated nationwide. I've been on XM Sirius Radio. I regularly appear on the Bill O'Reilly Show, and I take down Sean Hannity. He says I give him a headache. So I don't just take apart the right wing. I bring them on my show. I give the debates that you want to hear when you argue with your colleagues, you know, at the water cooler, at the family dinner table, those benighted conservatives that, let's face it, we all have as our family and friends. So check out the Inside Scoop. We deal with everything: economics, law, politics. Sometimes we even have Nancy Skinner on and she makes me talk about Kim Kardashian, but I don't like that. So we have a well-balanced meal of radio for you. Check out the Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Mark Levine, every Sunday, noon to 3 p.m., right here on We Act Radio.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.
Welcome back to the Inside Scoop. This is Mark Levine talking about immigration reform. Specifically, how are the Mexican immigrants of today any different from the German, Irish, Italian, Jewish, Chinese, African, Dominican immigrants of the last 200 years? I submit they are not. The irony is, if you look at the stereotypes of Mexican immigrants in the United States, most of them, I think, at least the ones I hear, are positive. People say they work very, very hard and very low wages, and you often find Mexican immigrants picking crops in the field and under difficult conditions, or working in landscaping or things like that. Now, why would we want to refuse hard-working people in America? By the way, when it comes to criminals, and I don't think immigrants are more likely to be criminal than any other poor person, it's going to be a small percentage of them. And Barack Obama and I agree that we should deport the criminals. I have no problem with that. But for the hardworking people, the argument is, well, they didn't come here legally. They should get at the end of the line. To which I say, what line? What line? Do you know how many lines there are to get to America? There are many, and they're not all the same length. It's ironic that Marco Rubio has come up with the most progressive, or perhaps I should say least conservative, Republican plan for immigration reform. Marco Rubio is the child of Cuban immigrants. And Cuban immigrants don't wait in line. You can have someone from Mexico who wants to come here legally, and they can wait 30 years and never get in, whereas a Cuban merely steps on American soil and boom, they're legally here. That is American policy. American policy is explicitly, well, I don't know whether to say racist or nationalist, but it's based on the country you come from. If you're Irish today, thanks to the Kennedys and some others, it's very easy to become an American citizen. If you're Cuban, extremely easy to become an American citizen. If you're Mexican, it's very, very difficult. If you're Filipino, by the way, I just read this. Here legally as an American citizen, right now they are processing applications from 1989. That's right. If you applied 23 years ago, they're just now getting to your application. So to say to go to the end of a line that lasts forever and you may not ever get to the front until you're dead, to me that's a Kafkaesque solution, right? Do something that's impossible and And let's open our borders wide open. Not to criminals, not to terrorists. Don't get me wrong here. But instead of judging people by their ethnicity, by their nationality, let's judge them by, well, what kind of person they are. And if you're a terrorist, if you're a criminal, if you're a murderer, if you have been convicted of some crime, even if you're a thief, yeah, fine. I don't want you in. There are enough honest, hardworking people trying to get in that the criminals should not get in the back of the line. There should be no line at all, right? If you come here, we should deport you. I am fine with that. Right? I'm not saying bring in the Mexican drug dealers, okay? But in a country that is increasingly recognizing that we have to respect people of all walks of life, and while there's still racism in America, I think Americans would be shocked to know the distinctions we still have in our immigration law among nationalities. I mean, if you are talking with American citizens and you heard someone say, oh, well, that person's, I don't know, pick a culture, Japanese or African or whatever it is. Oh, they're Mongolian, don't trust them. We'd be shocked. You don't say that in America. You certainly don't say that in polite company. We understand that whether you're Asian American or African American, Latino American or white American, which of course has subgroups, whether it's Irish or Italian or whatever it is, the quality that distinguishes you is what kind of an American you are. Why should we have any different rule with regard to our immigrants? Does it matter whether we have a Mexican or a German coming to America? What should matter is the person honest? Are they hardworking? Are they going to contribute to America? That's the question. And I say the vast majority of immigrants have and do and made this country great. And unless someone has committed a crime or is a member, and you know what? And I'm fine with excluding people from being members in terrorist organizations. Just because you have a free speech right as a citizen of America to say whatever you want about the government, if you come in and you say, I want to overthrow the U.S. government, I am fine with saying, you know what? Stay home. We don't want your kind here. So I'm willing to make free speech distinctions, but I'm not willing to make national distinctions. So Marco Rubio, thank you for being so nice as to reach out and give Mexican Americans a chance. I actually do appreciate that because I think you have gone farther in your party than virtually any Republican has. There used to be a time when John McCain, George W. Bush supported immigration reform, and then Barack Obama became president, and they all ran away in the other direction. But how about a little bit of humility, Senator Rubio? How about a little recognition that you are senator today because you're lucky enough to be born Cuban American and not Mexican American, which is a distinction without a difference. I mean, Cuban Americans, have they suffered under Castro? Yes, they have. Mexican Americans, have they suffered under the current corrupt Mexican government, which they do elect their leaders, but the leaders have very little control over the country, where you've got extreme corruption and roving gangs of terrorists, narco-terrorists. They're killing tens of thousands of people. In fact, I don't know whether life is better for the poorest of Cubans and the poorest of Mexicans, but I would bet they're better for the Cubans. I would bet that the average Cuban lives a higher standard of living than the average Mexican. That's no praise for Castro or for the Mexican government. But recognize, Marco Rubio, that you are Senator of the United States, even though your parents were immigrants. And that's a good thing. And now you're telling Mexican Americans they have to wait not 5 years, not 10 years, but 20 or 30 years to be on a path to citizenship. And that's a step forward for your party? Think again. Think again. What if your parents were Mexican? If there's no moral difference between Cubans and Mexicans, then maybe we should just get rid of nationality restrictions altogether. This is the part that's not being discussed in the current immigration debate. When people say go to the back of the line, I think there's this implicit assumption. There's this long line, first come, first served. Let the people that applied in 1990 come in before the people that applied in 1995. That's not how our system works at all. Just look at the law, right? If you marry someone and you're straight, they can come in right away. They can come in the next day. They get a green card. If you marry someone and you're gay, That's not a fair line. Where the straights get to the front and the gays go to the back. That's no more fair than the Cubans in the front and the Mexicans in the back. Now, I understand family unification principles. I get it. It makes sense to me that if you're an American and you've got a spouse, that they should get preference over if you're a Mongolian who has no ties to America and you want to get in. So I understand that Americans and their families have priority. I'm actually okay with that. But let's give an identical priority to all. If our immigration system were fair, I'd have fewer complaints with people who are saying, wait your turn at the back of the line. If our immigration system were rational, then I could understand why people would say, wait your turn. But it's not fair, and it's not rational, and anyone that knows the system knows it. You ever had someone try to get a visa? Do you know the little tricks and traps they can do? If you know someone, it might have a better shot. Whatever happened to equality under the law? So when we get this immigration debate, and it's going to come to the fore, and you're going to hear the Republicans say, Obama is saying these people who broke the law should get their place, they should get in the front of the line. And what about those people waiting patiently in the line? I say it's not a fair line. If you have a line where white people get in the front and black people get in the back, where straight people get in the front and gay people get in the back, where Cubans get in the front and Mexicans get in the back, then don't be surprised if people want to break the line. I don't like line breakers. But if you got someone that's always being put in the back of the line based on things they can't control, like their ethnicity and their sexual orientation, I say screw the line, come all in, even if you have to go across the borders, and let's be fairer for once, as face it, Americans have always been fair for generations. Every generation, it seems, there is a wish to exclude the newcomer. I mean, here you have, after the American Revolution, 1/3 of Americans were traitors to the new country. They had fought, they were loyalists, they were Tories, they fought for Great Britain. We had to welcome them in. But already they get in and they want to exclude the Germans and the Irish. After the Civil War, we had rebels, we had Southerners who had fought against the United States of America. We accepted them back in the fold, but they didn't allow the African Americans who'd been in this country just as long as they had, didn't give them a chance to succeed. The reason we passed the Civil War amendments was to give equal protection under the law to everyone. And in immigration reform, if you take out the racism, and you take out the homophobia, and you take out all the ways that human beings are distinguished based on things that they cannot control, just do that, and you'll have common sense immigration reform. Tell that to the Republicans. This is Mark Levine. This is the Inside Scoop. We'll be right back with more of it, and I want to talk also about Chuck Hagel and the nomination fight, and really the strange view that many have, including the Obama administration, about the nature of democracy around the globe. I am concerned that Barack Obama and his Secretary of Defense, Chuck Hagel, are taking in the wrong lesson. And I'll explain what I mean when we come back. This is Mark Levine, the Inside Scoop. If you want to follow me on Twitter, Mark Levine Talk. My website's marklevinetalk.com. We'll be right back right after this. Welcome back to the Inside Scoop. This is Mark Levine. If you want to call in and make me wear these funky headphones again, just dial in 202-889-9797, 202-889-9797. I want to change the topic a little bit because in the news this week has been a lot of discussion of foreign policy. That's because, well, for one thing, Hillary Clinton has had her last day as Secretary of State. John Kerry's taken over. But also, much bigger deal, the confirmation hearings for Chuck Hagel, who is scheduled, if confirmed, to replace Leon Panetta as Secretary of Defense. I'm not a fan of Chuck Hagel. I'm a liberal. I'm a progressive. Not a fan. I love Leon Panetta, and I wish he could stay another 4 years. But it's true that my concerns with Chuck Hagel are really my concerns with Barack Obama. Unlike some liberals, I'm not afraid to criticize the President of the United States. The funny thing is when I look at my progressive values, when it comes to international values, I have a longer look. I think a lot of liberals, progressives today, it's almost like history began under George W. Bush. And you look at history through the lens of George W. Bush and alone through that lens, you're going to say, well, we invaded a country that never attacked us. That's Iraq. We went into Afghanistan rightfully after they attacked us, but stayed way too long for 10 years trying to rebuild a country that has never been particularly built. The British tried to invade. The Russians tried to invade. Frankly, the Afghanis themselves are not very literate, and they're really a tribal society where it's almost not a nation, frankly. There's Kabul, the capital, and then there's a whole bunch of tribal regions. So it's very easy to say that George Bush screwed up 2 wars, and I think he did. Thousands of Americans are dead that wouldn't be dead. Tens of thousands of walking wounded. There's military people who've been so courageous, but their tank landed on an IED, an explosive device that blew them up, and maybe they lost an arm or a leg, and they're walking around with mechanical limbs. And you ask, what's it all worth? What's it for? And I understand people who see Iraq, see Afghanistan, see Vietnam, and say, well, it's ridiculous. Why are we, the classic liberal line is, why are we fighting abroad when we've got problems here at home? I take a longer view, I guess. I go back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. At that time, it was he who wanted to intervene to help Great Britain fight the Nazis, and it was the right that were the isolationists. They were the ones that said, hey, we've got problems here at home. Don't worry about the Nazis. We've got to focus on the Great Depression. So the whole conflict of isolationist versus internationalist is a different conflict from liberal and conservative. And I will not let the isolationist view become the liberal view or the leftist view, not on my watch. There are liberal isolationists and there are liberal interventionists, internationalists, perhaps I should call it. There are conservative isolationists. Pat Buchanan comes to mind. George Will comes to mind. And there are certainly conservative internationalists. The whole neoconservatives come to mind. So what is the difference between all of us? And why am I concerned that Barack Obama is becoming an isolationist? I think to answer that question, you have to go back and say, are wars ever just? There's some on the left that perhaps would say war is hell. Wars are never just. There's no reason ever to have a war. I disagree with that assertion. I think most people do. People understand that self-defense is necessary. That if you're attacked, you got to fight back. That war is sometimes a necessary evil. Evil, to be sure, but sometimes necessary. The real question comes, when should the United States put military power where a country didn't attack us? Where should we get involved in a place that maybe has no direct connection to the United States of America? And I think when you talk about Iraq or you talk about Afghanistan, or today when many people talk about Iran, sometimes even the way people talk about Syria, they're like, well, these aren't countries that matter much to the United States. It's the same argument really people made in the 40s. Great Britain isn't that important. France isn't that important. The Nazis are in Germany. They won't come and affect us. And yet it could go too far in the other direction, right? Vietnam was an incredible mistake. Iraq was an incredible mistake. Afghanistan was too. Interestingly, liberals, when it comes to countries like Rwanda or Cambodia, and we see movies about the killing fields, we see movies about the massive genocide, then we say, why didn't America do something? Why didn't America do something during the Holocaust? So when we see mass murder, the same liberals that are against our intervention support it. What could be a consistent view? I think there are 2 reasons to get involved in a country that did not attack us. It's not self-defense. And one I think is legitimate and one is not. One is for national resources. And I think you'll see that most conservative wars are fought over national resources. We want oil. We're in Iraq because it has oil. We're sending troops down in Central America 100 years ago because they got things we want, whether it's bananas for the United Fruit Company or oil or other natural resources. To me, that is not a legitimate reason to fight a war. But preventing mass murder is a legitimate reason. Preventing the Holocaust, preventing the genocide in Rwanda, the genocide in Darfur, which I argued strenuously we should do something about, preventing the killing feeds in Cambodia, preventing the killing that started to go on in Kosovo that Bill Clinton did around 1995 or so, and preventing the massacre that would have occurred in Libya that I supported with Barack Obama. It's why I support action in Syria today. I try to be consistent, and I'm not going to consistently say we should never be abroad, and I'm not going to consistently say we should always be abroad. The question is, what should be our principles? And I'll tell you something else. I think we've gone about things the wrong way. I mean, if you look at the war in Kosovo, what did Bill Clinton do? He used American air power to stop the Serbian massacre of the Kosovo people. We lost extremely few American lives. I think one plane was downed. I think we lost 3 American lives. 3 is a lot less than the 2,000 plus that have been killed in Afghanistan, the 4,000 or so in Iraq, the tens of thousands of wounded, not to mention the hundreds of thousands of Afghanis and Iraqis that died in the war, and the millions that have been displaced. Kosovo is a lot like Libya, where again, we achieved through air power and through the people themselves fighting their own battles, a significant victory with little loss and not that much cost to American lives. Let's not put all wars in the same category. Let's distinguish between liberal wars, if you will, like Kosovo, like Libya, done by liberal presidents with limited means, mostly air power, but they succeeded at relatively little cost, and conservative wars where they send a whole army to invade a country in Iraq and Afghanistan, causing thousands of lives lost, trillions of dollars, not to mention horrible dysfunction in the countries themselves. And let's not consider intervention or not a liberal or a conservative idea. This is my problem with Chuck Hagel. It seems to me that Chuck Hagel learned the wrong lesson from Vietnam and the wrong lesson from Iraq. Hagel, I think, and I fear President Obama has learned the lesson that American force is never a good idea. That American force is never the right thing to do, even when people are being massacred, as they are in Syria today. Even when a country poses an existential threat, like the country of Iran, or frankly, the country of North Korea. I mean, Bill Clinton kept North Korea from getting nuclear weapons. Under George W. Bush, North Korea got nuclear weapons. So let's just think about what is reasonable in a war. It's not reasonable to try to fight the great, massive, powerful country of China, even though the brutality they've done to Tibet is clear. We can't fight China. We shouldn't fight China. Even though, obviously, I have sympathy for the Tibetan people. But if you take a country like Syria, where the dictator is using Syrian planes to strafe Syrian villages, actually causing the Syrian Air Force to murder hundreds of thousands, or at least tens of thousands, there's maybe more than 100,000, of innocent Syrian people, I think that that's where we need to go in. I mean, here's the thing. If we go in Libya, which has oil, and we don't go into Syria, that to me is a conservative vision. A vision of, ooh, there are resources there. Let's take them. They're ours. We're Americans. We can have anything we want. Rather than a liberal vision, internationalist vision of saving lives. Let's fight wars only when they will save more lives. If we intervene in Syria, we will save lives. Tens of thousands of people will be living today if we had intervened a year ago. And there's tens of thousands of people that will be murdered in the next year if we don't intervene now. That is a reason to risk life and limb to save more lives and more limbs. Don't fight life and limb over oil. But don't refuse to fight life and limb over humanity. And
I really think that liberals see the mistakes of George W. Bush today and say, well, obviously we shouldn't intervene ever in Iran or in Syria or in Mali or any other place on earth. And I think that's the wrong lesson. The lesson of George W. Bush is not never to intervene. The lesson is don't intervene for the wrong reasons with the wrong amount of force. Don't occupy a country where the people themselves are not struggling themselves to overthrow their government. That sometimes pinprick solutions, right, bombing a terrorist training camp with a drone is the right solution. It's a lot better than invading a country where there's almost no Al-Qaeda left and then seeing Al-Qaeda spring up in Yemen and Mali and Somalia and elsewhere around the globe. We cannot invade every country on earth, that's for sure. I don't think we should invade hardly any country on earth. But that doesn't mean we can't, if not win, fight a war against terrorism. We can never win a war against terrorism because there's always going to be terrorist groups fighting everywhere. But if we start looking at our foreign policy not like where can we throw our troops around, but where can we do the most good and save the most lives, we can come up with a liberal internationalist vision. And I would argue that's the right vision for America. 202-889-9797 if you want to call in. Let me know your views on this. 202-889-9797. This is Mark Levine. We'll be right back right after this. The Inside Scoop, this is Mark Levine. If you want to call in, it's 202-889-9797, 202-889-9797. I am on We Act Radio every Sunday from noon to 3. The first hour is the Raucous Caucus with Garland Nixon and Terry DeKester. You heard some of Terry earlier today. And then comes the Inside Scoop, where I try to give you the inside scoop on everything going on in the world, whether of legal or political or whatever basis. The reason I'm talking about foreign policy largely is because it's, we have transitions. We have transitions in the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense. But I also think we need to have a smarter look at foreign policy and specifically at the Arab Spring. I don't think Barack Obama really knows, or most people really know, how to get a handle on what's going on in the Arab world, to understand not only what the motivations are, but how to make a successful transition to democracy. It's always been difficult to make a transition from a dictatorship to a democracy. Just ask the French during the French Revolution, or the Russians during the Russian Revolution. Right? The French Revolution famously had a reign of kings who were brutal. People died in the streets in poverty in France. The famous quote that's almost certainly apocryphal, it didn't happen, but it's said to have occurred when Marie Antoinette is surrounded by all these fancy cakes. She's the Queen of France, and they say that the people are starving, and she supposedly said, well, why don't they just eat cake? I got plenty of cake here. Of course, the peasants didn't have bread. Now, even though she probably didn't say that, this idea that the French kings and queens did not give a damn about the suffering of the ordinary French people is certainly true. And then what happens? The French have a revolt. At first it begins to be democratic. They come out and they have the slogans, liberty, equality, fraternity, liberté, égalité, fraternité. And they take over the government, they free the Bastille, and within 4 years, the French people themselves are killing each other. They've killed not only the king, but the aristocrats, blood's running in the streets. Mr. Guillotine comes up with a new invention that leads to a bunch of heads separated from their bodies, and this is often called the Reign of Terror. So revolutions don't always succeed. That's not a Western thing, that's a human thing. Because people are so angry at the people in power, they often go too far, and they go too far in the other direction. In the Russian Revolution, again, the Democrats actually do take over from the Tsar, who was a very bad leader, and for about 8 or 9 months, there really is freedom in Russia in 1917, and then the communists take over, and they do their coup d'etat, and, well, the history of the Soviet Union, that's the next 80 years or so. So how do we have revolutions that succeed? Why did the American Revolution succeed where the French Revolution and Russian Revolution failed? And I think the answer is the American Revolution went relatively slowly. Not that much changed. Sure, we got rid of the British, but we still had white men owning property still in charge. We didn't get rid of slavery. That didn't happen until the Civil War. But we also didn't overturn the society. We didn't have previously We didn't kill the British king. We didn't have massive massacres in the streets. I bring in this history to compare it to today's Arab Spring. And I think we've seen, just like, after the fall of communism, right? We saw in Romania, in Ukraine, in Belarusia, we had some very strong takeovers where people killed the prior dictator and massive attacks in the streets. And those countries are not as liberal as countries like the Czech Republic or Poland, countries where the reaction was less severe. And it's not that the dictators don't deserve all the misery they can get, but I think there are, if you will, slow revolutions and fast revolutions. And the best ones are the slow ones. And I saw Fareed Zakaria this morning talk about why Jordan and Morocco are the more successful Arab revolutions. I would argue Tunisia belongs in that group. In Jordan and Morocco, you have kings, but they're allowing a constitutional monarchy. I mean, England, after all, transformed from a dictatorship, a monarchy, the king rules, to one of the great democracies of the world, and did so with almost no bloodshed, and did so over time as Parliament got more and more and more rights over centuries to become the country it is today. There was no reign of terror in Great Britain. And that's what's happening in Morocco. That's what's happening in Jordan. Tunisia, they got rid of the dictator, but there was a civil society, there was a educated middle-class people, and they've taken over, and I have high hopes for Tunisia as well. I have less high hopes, for a country like Iran. Iran is a lot more like the French Revolution, right? They got rid of a horrible dictator, the Shah, no question about it, but they replaced him with yet another dictator, someone else who mistreats the people so much that they had their own revolution called the Green Revolution a couple years ago. And is supporting terrorist activity all over the globe. In Libya, we had a much more violent revolution than in Tunisia, and the America, I think, helped make it more rational than it otherwise would have been, and I think that's why Libya is still a mess, but more likely to be on the road to success. And you have a country like Egypt. Egypt, they overthrew their dictator, but they went and they did elections first and civil society later. And I think there's some who think, elections, that's how you tell if it's a democracy. Just have elections. A democracy is much bigger than an election. Sure, elections are necessary for a democracy, but they're not sufficient. To have a true democracy, stable democracy, one that lasts over time, one that's respected by the people, you also need things like minority rights, individual rights, rights to practice your own religion, rights for women. Make sure that women have equal rights to men, rights for minorities, rights to challenge your government, to disagree with your government, free speech rights, rights to put out a newspaper and say, I disagree with the leader of the government. We in America do that without even thinking. And yet that is dramatic freedom. So an election is not enough. And I certainly was no fan of the Egyptian dictator Hosni Mubarak, and I had some hopes for the new person coming in, Mohamed Morsi, but I recognize that if you come from an illiberal tradition, such as Islamic fundamentalism, and you take over, you can be no better than the people that came before. That's what we saw happen in Iran. So what can the United States do to cause a more liberal democracy where individual rights and freedoms are respected, such as is occurring slowly in Morocco and Jordan, I think is successfully occurring in Tunisia? And how do you prevent the kind of Iranian, or I fear Egypt as well, solution where you go from one dictator, one pro-American dictator, and get to an anti-American Islamic fundamentalist dictator, and the people are no better off? I think the answer is that you support those elements that support democracy. It's really that simple. I'm not saying go fix elections, to be sure, but I am saying that if you look at what we did in Libya, you can see that the reason why the Libyan people, actually most of them love America, is because we saved them from genocide. We saved them from, if not genocide, mass murder. We helped them get rid of their dictator. They did it. We didn't invade like in Iraq. They did it themselves, but we helped them with air power. And so they went ahead and they have a government that's pretty pro-American, frankly pretty liberal. They did not put in an Islamic fundamentalist dictatorship. It's a weak government, to be sure. There were terrorist attacks in Benghazi. Libya's not out of the woods yet. But Libya, I think, poses a model when we look at the next country falling apart. The most severe falling apart we've seen anywhere in the Arab world. Of course, I'm talking about Syria. More than 100,000 innocent Syrians are now dead. In fact, it's hard to know the numbers exactly because the Syrian government doesn't allow the press to come in and report on it. But the rebels, under overwhelming odds, with tremendous support from the Syrian people, but virtually no weapons, certainly no sophisticated weapons, with the Syrian Air Force bombing them from the air, they're actually taking back their country. And they're doing so with no help from us. I've been arguing for 2 years now that we need to help the people of Syria get their country back, just as we did in Libya, and that if we did, we could have a more democratic Syria that is not just good for the Syrian people, but is pro-Western too. A country that recognizes, in a country like Syria where there are lots of minorities, there are Christians, there are Sunni Muslims, and there are Shia Muslims, there are Druze, there are all kinds of people in Syria, that as long as you had a democratic group that respected individual rights, supported by the United States, it is likely that Syria could transition to a country that is not an Assad-like horrible dictatorship, and not an Islamic fundamentalist dictatorship. We wouldn't have to go from the Shah of Iran to Ayatollah Khomeini. We could actually go to a modern, secular democracy, as we've tried to do in Libya, as we've done with our allies in Morocco and Jordan. But the Obama government did not listen to me. I think they and people like Chuck Hagel are wrapped up with this idea that we should never be involved in foreign affairs, which makes no sense because we were just in Libya. And if it's not about oil, what is the difference between Libya and Syria? Syria's a bit harder. I accept that. But now what's happening in Syria? After 2 years of crying out, begging, and I brought people on this show. I brought people from Syria who risked their lives to come on this show to talk about the horrific situation, to talk about the Syrian military walking into a home and gunning everybody down, bombing innocent schools just to kill children, just to make people, I guess, give up on the revolution. And we've done nothing. Obama said a few things. The situation in Syria has to stop. We've done nothing. A little bit of humanitarian aid, perhaps. So now what's happening is the Syrian people are turning to whoever can help them. Whoever has the arms to fight against the butcher of Damascus, Hafez Assad and his son, Bashir Assad, the current dictator of Syria. The Assad family, Hafez is dead. They've been turning to whomever they can to fight them. So if it's Al-Qaeda, hey, sometimes you have to turn to the devil to fight the devil. What that means is at the end of the day, when the Assad regime falls, and mark my words, the Assad regime will fall. It's only a matter of time. I predict it will happen in this year, 2013, probably after another 50,000 people are murdered. But I think it's going to happen this year. If not this year, certainly next year. It cannot sustain itself. It will fall. The heroes of the Syrian revolution will not be the United States, and they won't be the West, and they won't even be the Syrian people. The heroes of the Syrian revolution are going to be Al-Qaeda. And you take the most sympathetic people in the world, the Syrian people who are being massacred by their own government, and due to our inaction, they're going to become our enemies. And this is an accident waiting to happen, and one that we can stop now. And if it were me interviewing Chuck Hagel, I would say to Chuck Hagel, do you think the Assad regime is going to last? And listen to what he's going to say. I think he's going to say no. I think everyone knows it can't last. We don't know whether it's going to end next month or next year, but it can't last. And then I would say, when it falls, do you want a government that's pro-American or anti-American? Do you want a government that's pro-democracy or anti-democracy? Do you want a government that says our best elements are the students and middle-class shopkeepers who rose up to protect our villages from a madman? Or do you want a culture that praises Al-Qaeda and Islamic fundamentalist terrorists who are anti-American and praises them for saving them from an even worse dictator. See, all you have to do is look at the arc of history to understand that we should be on the right side of it. Once we see that a dictator is going to fall, we have run out to support the people. But in Egypt, you may recall, President Obama didn't withdraw his support from Hosni Mubarak till about 2 weeks before Hosni Mubarak left office. It was a little late. Syria is already extremely late. But better late than never. We Americans should be on the side of freedom and democracy and human rights all over the globe. And even though we can't invade hardly any of these countries, and we shouldn't invade hardly any of these countries, we can help. We can do no-fly zones that cost very little. You know, the war in Libya cost $1 billion, and that sounds like a lot until you recognize that the war in Iraq cost $1 trillion, or 1,000 times that. The Libyan war lasted a few months. The Iraqi war lasted almost 10 years. The Libya war led to no American loss of life. The Iraqi war, 4,000 Americans dead. The Libyan war, the people were fighting themselves to free themselves from the dictator. In Iraq, the people weren't fighting at all. We just invaded to take over. It's a huge mistake to compare Iraq to Libya, to compare Iraq to Syria. It's a huge mistake to compare Iraq to Iran. Again, no one is advocating invading Iran, certainly not me. But remember, we went to war in Iraq precisely because the Bush administration believed, or at least persuaded Americans to believe, that Iraq had nuclear weapons. And even though they used the code words weapons of mass destruction, which is a silly, silly thing, to combine biological and chemical weapons, which are not good things, with nuclear weapons is a ridiculous mismatch. It's like saying we have to be afraid of pins in our... I can think of a better example. We have to be afraid of, in our food, of chicken bones and arsenic. Yeah, it's not good to choke on a chicken bone, but arsenic's a lot more dangerous. We have to be afraid of someone giving us a pinprick with a pin and someone firebombing our house. Well, you just can't put those two in the same category. And what George Bush did is he said, weapons of mass destruction, biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons. Well, now hang on here. And I realize George W. Bush ain't the brightest light bulb in the universe. But biological and chemical weapons, as awful as they are, biological weapons, what's the worst that's been used? Anthrax, sarin gas. These aren't good things. What have they killed? A few dozen people? Nothing like the 30,000 Americans killed by ordinary guns that are not biological or chemical. The worst chemical weapons that I can think of is mustard gas, and that's been around since World War I. And killed a lot of people in World War I, but nothing like what conventional weapons have done. So biological and chemical weapons, they ain't good. No weapons are good. But they're nothing like nuclear weapons. And I think with Iraq, what the administration did, the Bush administration, is they conflated them all, weapons of mass destruction, WMDs. We even had a WMDs, as if biological and chemical weapons were anything like nuclear weapons. And they're not. As I said, biological and chemical weapons are less dangerous than airstrikes. Our firebombing of Dresden in World War II killed tens of thousands of people. And firebombs are a lot more dangerous than chemical or biological weapons, and yet they're conventional. Nuclear weapons, completely different. Nuclear weapons, one weapon can take out a city. We saw that with Hiroshima. And the weapons that the Iranians are building right now are far more severe than anything we used against Hiroshima. That really is dangerous. And the irony is America was willing to go to war to stop Iraq from getting nuclear weapons. I don't think we really understood the difference between biological and chemical, because I think it's ridiculous to go to war to stop a chemical or biological weapon. But I don't think it's ridiculous to go to war to stop a nuclear weapon. Frankly, I wish we'd stopped North Korea from getting nuclear weapons. Bill Clinton succeeded, and George Bush just let it happen. But to stop them, you don't have to invade a country. See, there are ways to stop them without the kind of full-scale, expensive, dangerous, risky invasions that we did in Iraq and Afghanistan, where we occupy a country for 10 years. In fact, Iraq really was starting to get nuclear weapons in 1982. Israel bombed the Osiris nuclear plant, and in a few days, the threat was dissipated, and very few people died. When Syria started to develop nuclear weapons, again, Israel bombed Syria, and thank God they did. Can you imagine nuclear weapons being involved in this horrible civil war right now in Syria? We need, if Iran will not respond, and so far they're not responding to sanctions at all, we need a military option to get rid of their nuclear weapons. And I know many say, Mark, that's not a progressive view, that's not a liberal view. Let me tell you why it is. Let me tell you why it is a liberal view. First of all, I'm not advocating invading Iran. That would be really ridiculous and foolhardy. That would be really stupid. Number two, I'm not talking about biological or chemical weapons, which aren't that dangerous. I'm talking about nuclear, which is extremely dangerous. And third, I'm not talking about a relatively stable government like the Soviet Union or China that have nuclear weapons that we can contain, right? I'm talking about a country that has its own revolution where its leaders may not last very long. It certainly does not have very popular leaders. If we can stop a nuclear arms race in the Middle East, where Iran gets nuclear weapons, and then Saudi Arabia gets nuclear weapons, and then Egypt wants nuclear weapons, and then Libya and Turkey, and suddenly everyone in the region wants nuclear weapons. And then for all we know, the emir of Bahrain gets his nuclear weapons and shoots them off, and then what's going to happen? Right? People saying we shouldn't have war in Iran. Of course we shouldn't have war against Iran. But taking out a country's nuclear capability should not lead to war. And if it does, we have to be ready to fight back. Iran is already promoting terrorism all across the globe. So I just think we have to think this through. It's not that war is always a bad thing. It's that war should be a last resort. And we shouldn't use it unless we need to. And there's all kinds, right? You can do what we're doing with drones. You could argue right now that we're at war in Yemen, in Pakistan, in Somalia, and in Mali. I don't think we are. To me, sending drones out does not constitute war. It constitutes destroying a danger. But it's very different from the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq. So we should be able to make distinctions as liberals between an all-out war and all-out invasion and destroying a threat. Again, I don't think we should put our heads in the sand and just allow threats to occur. I don't think that if we do nothing and just ignore the world, that we should let Al-Qaeda flourish and let Iranian terrorism flourish. But we can fight back in cheap ways, in ways without going to war, without sending a bunch of troops in. And to rule those out, I think makes America weaker. So I really need to have this argument. I'll tell you what, I'll do a future show where I'll bring on someone who disagrees with me, and I know many of you do. But think about the reasons you disagree. It shouldn't be Bush screwed up Iraq, therefore we can't ever intervene militarily in the world. And it can't be that military intervention is always wrong. Unless you're a pacifist, I think you recognize that we have fought wars that have had good results. World War II, horrible, horrible destruction. 400,000 or so Americans died. Tens of millions of people all around the world died. But at the end of the day, it was a necessary evil. It was a necessary war. Once you accept the fact that some wars are necessary, ask yourself, how do you define which ones are and which ones aren't? And that, to me, is a question that should have been asked Chuck Hagel. When is a war necessary? It's a basic question. When is a war necessary? And I say it's necessary in self-defense. It's necessary to prevent mass murder. And I also think that taking out a threat is different from all-out war. That we don't always have to go. In fact, we should virtually never do all-out war. That sometimes the best way is, bombing a terrorist training camp rather than occupying all of Afghanistan. Something Joe Biden's been saying for a long time. This is Mark Levine, 202-889-9797. If you want to give some final thoughts on what I've said or anything else, please feel free to call in. 202-889-9797. We'll be right back with the last bit of the Inside Scoop right after this. Welcome back to Inside Scoop. This is Mark Levine. This is our last segment here. We only got a few minutes more. I want to talk a little bit about the Super Bowl. Now, I don't do much sports on this show, to be sure. That's not what I know a lot about. I'm the guy that knows history and law. I'm not the guy to tell you between the Ravens and the 49ers. I guess I want to talk a little bit about Baltimore and San Francisco. They're both solid blue cities, right? They're very liberal. They're very progressive cities. It's hard as a progressive. I got sympathies for San Francisco and Baltimore. But when you think about those two cities, to me, San Francisco is the city of rich liberals and Baltimore is the city of poor liberals, right? Working class people. When I think of San Francisco, I think of liberal-minded, to be sure, but people with wealth, maybe some gay people that are going around living in a beautiful city by the bay and practicing the latest technology and keeping in touch and definitely supporting environmental things and things like that. When I think of Baltimore, I think of working class people striving to make a living and struggling to succeed, and that's unions, and that to me that's also definitely part of the liberal ideal. So it's hard for me to choose between them. I guess I want them both to win. I wasn't gonna. I was just gonna talk about the Super Bowl, but I got a caller on the line at the very last few minutes. Go ahead, caller. Who's this?
Hi, Mark. It's Michael.
Okay.
From New York City.
Hey, Michael.
You want a Super Bowl input?
Sure. Go ahead. I was talking more about the cultural input than the actual teams, but go right ahead.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No, it's okay. Go ahead.
I'm hoping for Baltimore Ravens for two reasons. Number one, they were robbed last year of championship status and trying to get into the Super Bowl. If anybody remembered that game, it was a game-winning touchdown pass caught that should have given it to the Ravens. But 3 seconds later, a Patriots knocked the ball out of the catcher's hands in front of the referee, and the referee, instead of ruling it a touchdown, ruled it an incomplete pass. I don't know what was going through this referee's mind, but a lot of people said the Ravens were robbed in the chance of getting into the Super Bowl. Now they have a chance to compensate what they did last year, and this leads to the second reason. One of the players, and I'm sorry, I keep forgetting his name, he is retiring after this, and so I thought it would be kind of sweet for him to retire as a Super Bowl champion. You know what I'm saying?
That's fine. I mean, all of that is very specific for and about the teams, and that's all good. I was talking about the fact that, as a Democrat, as a liberal, it's hard to think of two bluer cities in America than San Francisco and Baltimore. But there's very different images, in my mind, at least, of the two cities. Baltimore, when I think of Baltimore, I think of a gritty city. I think of unions. I think of working class people. I think of people working in factories. They're solid Democrats, but they're the lunch pail Democrats. And I think of San Francisco, I got to use a stereotype. I think of latte sipping Democrats. I think of wealthy liberals sitting by the bay. Now, I know there are homeless people in San Francisco, to be sure, and I know there are rich liberals in Baltimore, to be sure. But to me, I think of both parts of the coalition, and I think about how dramatic it is that two extremely different cities like San Francisco and Baltimore can agree on policies. And I don't know, to me it's part of the depth of progressive cause that Baltimore and San Francisco can come together and be such strong liberal cities. So I want them both to win, but I don't think that's possible.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. If it were to end in a tie, it's going to overtime.
Well, that's true. That's true. No, I understand that. It's got to be resolved.
Look at it this way. They are both champions right now in their respective conferences.
Absolutely. No question about it. I don't know about you, but I'm going to watch the Puppy Bowl. The Puppy Bowl is put on by Animal Planet each year. This is the 9th annual Puppy Bowl, and if you haven't seen it, you got to turn it on. You won't miss the Super Bowl. It starts actually right when this show ends, in 9 minutes. You can watch it at 3 o'clock Eastern Time. Animal Planet. I'm not being paid for this endorsement. Go and turn on the Animal Planet, and what they do is they stick a bunch of extremely cute, kind of too cute puppies, and they put them on like a little football field, and whoever gets the chew toy across the finish line, that team scores a touchdown. And it's the most adorable thing you've ever seen. The cats do the halftime show, the kittens, I should say, because they're puppies and kittens. Do not miss Puppy Bowl 9. And if you have someone who doesn't like sports, I don't mean to be sexist here, but maybe a girlfriend or a wife. But listen, lots of women like sports, lots of men don't. If you have someone who doesn't like sports, tune them into the Puppy Bowl, and maybe you can have a nice compromise. If your boyfriend makes you watch the Super Bowl with him, you can make your boyfriend watch the Puppy Bowl with you, and then you can actually share something as a couple. So that's my recommendation. I don't care whether the 49ers or the Ravens win. I say go Puppies. I'm pro puppy.
So funny.
I am pro puppy. It's true though. Check it out.
That is so funny.
Michael, you check it out. We're going to talk about it, all right? Check out the Puppy Bowl. It starts in 8 minutes on the Animal Planet, all right? Hey,
I search for it, and please, people, don't dog out the puppy.
I'm not even going there. Michael, thank you for calling in. That's about my time here. This is Mark Levine. As I said, the Raucous Caucus and the Inside Scoop, I host them both. They are every noon to 3 right here on WEAC Radio, 1480 AM. Tune in next week for another edition of the Inside Scoop. And follow me on Twitter at Mark Levine Talk or on my website at marklevinetalk.com. This is Mark Levine signing off.